Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting from our quarantine zones, but so physically distant, but not socially isolated, as they say in Carolo. It's super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist and advisor to the Country Club, the Country Music Socialist Association of America, David Griscom.
How's it going?
Going well. On this week's program, Maximilian Alvarez from the Working People's Podcast. We're talking about what it is actually like to organize right now in the COVID age, the rumblings of labor unrest as monopoly capital consolidates itself. Where do we go from here? What's he hearing on the ground? Then the great Adolph Reed Jr., he's here. He's talking about a basic primer on essentialism. We critique it. We talk about it. What is it? How did he form that critique? And his own political journey towards against mystification and towards liberation for all. We've got a gem, as we always do. What are we talking about in the gem, Dave?
We're talking about the reopening and why it's not actually about economic growth.
Wow, shocking. We're who'd have thunk it? We're talking of that. We are also going to be touching on in the post game the Democrats, after a couple of grand theft bailouts for monopoly capitalism for the 1% in this country, they've come forward with their own bailout bill. Does it protect workers' salaries? No, but it seems to have a safety valve for bill collectors and some help for lobbyists. This is extraordinary and pathetic. We'll be talking about that in the post game. The Bolivia coup government and their response to COVID and elections. In 1916, the great Irish revolutionary James Connolly was murdered. Was murdered by the British state. We're going to talk about his legacy and also play a fascinating clip from former South African President Thabo Mbeki about the relationship between Ireland and South Africa in liberation. Of course, Ben Burgess and Joshua Kahn are going to be here in the post game. We're going to dissect the hearing on reopening with questions from Bernie Sanders and I think Alexander Colburn said of Rand Paul he seems dumb, I think was the quote. And dumb and also empathy free. Donald Trump is going to the bottom of the well for some new nonsense about Obama as he starts to panic about his reelect numbers. All of that and more in the post game, including new information. Let me tell you something. Juan Guaido, and I absolutely assume the Trump administration and their efforts to wage a coup in Venezuela are not sending their best. I'll just leave it at that. Definitely not sending their best. But first, we've got to talk about how monopoly capitalism is consolidating itself, how neoliberalism is consolidating itself. We're in a situation where the system keeps getting rocked. In 2008, an enormous amount of wealth was destroyed by the Wall Street meltdown. Even the jobs that were added back into the economy, more than half of them were temp jobs, were low paying, that fed into the freelance economy. Austerity took place across the globe, and the financial sector was recapitalized and consolidated further without any substantive or systemic accountability or reform. Several weeks into the coronavirus crisis, which is claiming many lives, over 70,000, and has led to tens of millions of jobs losses. Now, even Steve Mnuchin himself has suggested that we could reach above 20%. I think that is almost that is a certainty. Even with all of these shocks to the system and all of this endless evidence that this way of doing business, this way of designing the economy that rewards shareholders, that consolidates capital, that has no power or protection for workers, increases inequality, decreases lifespan for many, and does not work for the vast majority of people. Yes, more and more people are dissatisfied with the system, but actual political and material threats to it are vanishing. And in fact, several weeks into COVID, we're seeing a consolidation. We see enormous job losses and excellent performance by the stock market. Now, of course, can we keep going with greater and greater unemployment and greater stock performance? Probably not. At some point, we're going to need to cushion more people and get some more people back into the workforce. But even if that happens, and even if there is some trend towards social unrest, there is still no structural threat to the overwhelming consolidation of capital. And it is very likely, as the trend goes now, that even if the economy, quotes, starts to somewhat normalize and people become somewhat cushioned, they'll be going into the next wave of both monopoly power in the financial and tech sectors, and also decreased labor power and capacity. And I want to talk a little bit about a couple of things that go along with this. First of all is the democratic bailout that I alluded to before. This bailout does not have wage protections as put forward by Premila Jayapal. It does not have any systemic accountability that we've seen on the corporate sector so far at all. It doesn't have something like, as an example, card check, which would be an enormous shot in the arm for labor unions right now. It does have apparently bailout funds for lobbyists and debt collectors. Now, are there going to be some laudatory things in this bill and some things that are going to plug some vital gaps in people's immediate material needs? I have no doubt. And we'll see how much they get whittled down or what finally gets passed after Mitch McConnell has taken an axe to it in the Senate. But it is very clear that the Democratic Party leadership is absolutely firmly entrenched in the center or center-right of the neoliberal consensus. No change there. The IMF is forecasting a contraction of 3% global output and ongoing economic damage as a result of this. And of course, we can expect the World Bank and IMF to warn and potentially push for some narrow stimulus on one hand, and then just like in the United States, on the other hand, we're already seeing this with some Republicans, all of a sudden we're back to deficit talk, which is going to be another push in the United States for going after Medicare and Social Security, and already is one from these vicious assaults on food stamps and other vital programs by the Trump administration. Neoliberalism so far is being strengthened. Monopoly capital in the financial sector and in the tech sector is consolidating over all walks of life. Small businesses are collapsing, feeding more workers either into long-term unemployment or making them vulnerable to the Uber and temp economy as things start to kind of slowly reopen. Now, and of course, on the political terrain, what we have seen since the outset of this virus is Bernie Sanders' campaign folding, the nomination of Joe Biden. In Massachusetts, Ed Markey is trailing Joe Kennedy in the polls. And the German core, along with the Netherlands and others in the European Union, have not budged at all on loosening monetary policy or going against austerity to help the Southern zone, even in the midst of the corona pandemic. You know, I say this not because I want people to feel defeated and dispirited and like there's no possibility of a future. Of course there is. But if we're not real about the enormous odds that are stacked against working people and poor people and the enormous structural consolidation of capital, then we're deluding ourselves. We're telling ourselves a bedtime story. We need to be very real. There are cracks in the ideological foundations to some extent. There is some labor unrest, but the truth is that these systems are not only surviving, they're finding new ways of inventing themselves that could see them extend out their hegemony for decades into the future. Look at what Andrew Cuomo is doing in New York. He's taking this crisis to turn the city into the next level of an incubator for the Bill Gates campaign against public education, the Google model of surveillance-dominated smart cities, which undermine collective efforts, public investments, and turn the economy into even more temp and delivery, underpaid and non-unionized jobs. Now, there's no doubt that labor is getting more active again. We saw the incredible organizing of people like Chris Smalls at Amazon. We see even models from the center left, like in South Korea, or the incredible resiliency and success of the Communist Party in Kerala, having very effective relative global responses to COVID, to Corona. We're seeing, obviously, an ongoing draw and interest in new ways of designing the economy, in new ways of taking away corporate power, building serious social safety nets, a recognition that even as this rise of nationalism is happening, that there's a deep global interdependence when we're talking about pandemics, the environment, or labor itself, and also a need and interest to build local, anti-fragile, and responsive institutions. We can move forward in a constructive way, but we cannot be a marginal subculture. We cannot be delusional about how powerful capital is, and we need and absolutely must, and Benjamin Fong has a new very good piece on this, on the cultural baggage of the left, we need to find ways to meet with, add to, and synchronize with actually existing institutions, whether it be mainline labor organizations, or try to engage in constructive and reciprocal efforts to broaden out this politics so it is applicable and relevant for the many and not the few, and not relegated to an irrelevant backwater who can, as Daniel Bessner says, argue endlessly about small things because it has no serious prospect for power. Neoliberalism is able to use this crisis to reassert itself. We need to fight with every fiber of our beings against that happening. And we need to do that in a grounded, real, and strategic way. And that cannot allow us for any magical thinking. You guys, want to add?
Yeah, there's big news right now is that it looks like Uber is going to gobble up Grubhub, and
right.
And further assert itself in regular life in this country. Across the world, you're seeing global finance completely retreating from the third and developing world and returning to the United States. It's so yes, there's a crisis, right? But the reaction does not necessarily create something better. What it has actually done is it's created worse crises for other people. So yeah, we need to get as far away from any kind of magical thinking that these things are just going to right themselves, right? Because there's a crisis. I mean, the only way we're going to be able to match our opponents is with this kind of, serious organizing. That's not always going to be glamorous. It's not always going to be sexy, but it's that kind of daily on the ground struggle that's going to prepare us to deal with massive multinational corporations, massive financial international structures, and our political enemies, which we've been learning a lot in the past few months about how effective they still are at in the United States, especially at defeating any kind of left-wing project.
Yeah, I think that's why I feel like part of this job is making sure people don't waste their hope in the wrong places. And to me, one of those things just out of my mind lately is if we're discussing voting strategy for the general election, we're not actually keeping our eye on those things or building connections with the labor parties that we need to. It's just such a we need to stop indulging pointless conversations, basically.
Yeah, and we need to stop indulging fantasy politics, and we need to stop indulging, moral extremism. I mean, all of these things that, again, they sound like sub-pocket, and I wish they were sub-pocket irrelevant conversations, but the extent to which they even spend any time undermining our efforts to actually building something that's really constructive and strategic, they're a problem. We need to address them. And I do want to spend, and we will spend more time on the show, talking specifically to more people in the labor movement across the board about what can be constructively done. And I think, that's a very, very important site. There's still some and again, even with regards to voting, I mean, look, I make no secret. Obviously, I think voting tactically is a no-brainer. I think even if we understand that labor is key to all of this, then we have to look at things like who is a president's NLRB appointment's going to be, and then the compelling obviousness to get rid of the Republicans, again, becomes just totally obvious and very easy analysis. But the point is of where the most primary focus of energy and attention is. And there's plenty of people that want to have, just like you're saying, Matt, there's a lot of people that want to, still want to have some type of parasocial relationship with the Democratic Party and tell themselves a fantasy about how we're working on it and the Democratic Party is really good and all, total fantasy, total nonsense. Arguably, the Democratic Party is put simply, look, there's been no structural shift in the Democratic Party in the last several years, even despite the most incredible, valiant efforts of Bernie Sanders and others, who followed in his lead. There is no structural shift there. And everything from who the nominee is and the relationship to this crisis proves that beyond any shadow of a doubt. You can find individual people who've slightly moved to the left. And even frankly there, you have to contextualize. Like, has Gavin Newsom been relatively better than Andrew Cuomo? Sure. Frankly, I'm going to say that specifically in California's case, Bernie Sanders crushed California. And there's a different specific calculus there. But as a national effort, none at all. But then on the other hand, and Dustin Gostala has pointed this out really well, like, the relevance of doing a 2% protest vote that only actually reinforces how marginalized this politics is, achieves absolutely nothing. It does nothing. So, we need to keep both of those things in mind.
I want to stress that it's both sides of that conversation are selling hope, and it's just it's complete bullshit on both sides. Like, the left isn't gonna sit and turn this into a victory if we all decide to vote correctly on the general election day. Like, that's not going to work. And likewise, the Democratic Party, I honestly think we need to look at this as if Biden thinks he doesn't need the left at all, so fuck the left. And he might be right. So if we go and make this all about we're not going to give you our vote, what does it look like if he wins, which he might actually do? Then we've just spent this entire time advertising how they don't need us.
You need to reinvent the map if the terrain is not working for you. And I don't mean that in terms of, gut off and go marginalize, but you need to think of, okay, how do we hold back the damage? And then what are the long-term prospects to actually reorient politics? Because look, Bernie and these electoral projects offered us incredible, this is why I unapologetically focused on them, because they offered the possibility of potentially reversing decades in a much shorter period of time. Now they've failed, so we have to get back to thinking in those decades-long terms, basically.
Yeah, I just something else to make us think about what's going on in the world is if you look at Europe and what Germany is doing right now, Germany is basically holding on to the old EU line, right? The old neoliberal line, despite this massive crisis, right?
Yep.
And there's just some people who have this idea that just because of the gravity of the situation, that these organizations were going to, wake up, right? And they have. The Democratic Party has it in this country, and the European Union is continuing its role as a neoliberal institution. That's not, and I guess the second analysis too is that's not enough on our part to just point that out, right? We need to start really seriously figuring out how we're going to deal with that problem, because it's not going to crumble on its own, and that's what we're learning is they will actually go down with the ship rather.
Well, and I think also that there's a lot of resiliency in it. I think that actually, this is one thing that we can't be teleological, right? Even from a Marxist perspective. I think Marx read capital very well. He saw globalization. He saw monopoly coming. He saw the natural tendencies of how capital would reinforce itself and how it would consolidate. We see that undoubtedly in today's world. There's nothing mystical about it. There's a much greater concentration of corporate power and wealth in the modern iteration. And previous, again, the Keynesian reform effort was pushed back. It was rolled back starting in the 70s and coming through to today. And on the other hand, I still think, because we can see that I mean, obviously you couldn't anticipate everything. There's different, there's a lot of complexities to this, but one thing that isn't, projected in that story is the idea that monopoly platform capitalism can figure out different ways of inventing its way out of different crises. And actually it's done a pretty good job at that. And I think that's another thing, again, that we need to be really real about. So even just the idea that, okay, like the Germans are going to wake up or the Democratic Party is going to wake up, like, no, they're married to a completely different ideological project. And the only thing that they might be interested in doing is how to upgrade their models to fit a different moment. And that's, by the way, another thing that's very dangerous about this time, because I actually really do think that as markets become more scarce, as the ability to generate bubbles becomes more difficult, to sort of juice the system and get more broader buy-in, and you don't want to do redistribution because that raises people's expectations too much and that takes on too many incumbent interests. This is what Adolph's point has been, that dynamic favors the more right-wing side of neoliberalism, the more authoritarian, the more brutal, the more, kicking people down. And if you look at the Europeans, it's very interesting because they, the European centrists decry left and right-wing populism, but what they do is they object rhetorically and morally to aspects of right-wing populism while actually adopting a lot of the underlying, as an example, migration policies. And then they will fight to the mat, to the death, to never allow any type of this left economic program. And honestly, Syriza should have been the very clear lesson on that, because what Syriza was asking for when they first came into office in 2015 was very basic stuff. They were not asking to collectivize the means of production in Greece. They were saying, help us help you by not squeezing our economy with austerity. And the Troika wouldn't let that happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true, but I think I really like, and I really like this distinction that Anton Jaeger has been making a lot about neoliberalism lately, where he calls it hard but hollow, where it doesn't have it's hard in that it can come down really strong, to break up social movements, to arrest people, all those kind of hard powers of the state. But its actual economic control of the economic system inside of the state is actually quite hollow, and its connection to the base and to the mass is quite hollow. So they're also they're in a position of weakness too, in a way, and I think that we need to figure out how to operate around that. They're not able to organize society as completely as you would think, with how effective they can be at stopping social movements. When in power, they can't organize society in general and the economy in general to do what they want, which is high growth rates, right? They can't create that anymore.
That's true. They can't do high growth rates. That's true. I think, that is where we're not in the 90s anymore. But again, the dangerous thing becomes, does that filter to a slightly more kind of right-wing position? And I still think in the kind of elite world that there is a fight between that Singapore model and that Hungary model. But at any rate, this is all really good. We got to do a proper pitch, and then we're going to come back with Maximilian Alvarez. But I'll just say, guys, obviously we'll do it kind of short today, but let's actually start with, we'll play a little bit of our latest illicit history doc. $21 and above patrons allow these to happen. They take a lot of work, and then we release them for patrons first. And then after having them behind a paywall for a while, we release them on a playlist on YouTube so everybody can see them. Our goal ultimately is, to get as much content out as possible for everybody. And then obviously patrons get everything first and make everything possible. And a lot of stuff for in terms of just the full shows do stay behind the paywall. These, and increasingly we're trying to get more stuff out. So let's give them a little bit of a tease of this Thomas Sankara documentary, History and Narration by the great Milton Alamati, directed by Vic Viana with assistant editing and help from Forrest. So let's play a little bit of this, and you can watch this immediately in all illicit histories and get on. Sometimes we do group phone calls at 21 and above. And also when you become this patron level, this is significant, obviously, for helping us continue to grow and meet all of our obligations and take our next steps, like doing these illicit history documentaries, which have been awesome. And then we're going to come back and Matt will do a little bit more of a general Patreon spiel. But let's play some of this.
Que celui qui vous donne à manger vous dicte également.
Sankara actually grew up in what many would say was a relatively privileged family, in that his father was a functionary in the colonial regime. His family actually wanted him to go to a seminary, wanted him to become a priest, but he decided to go to sign up into the military because that was one of the few national-oriented organizations. And when he was in the military, that's when he actually met with a professor who was a civilian teaching in the schools, and started giving him more like a personal tutorial into history, into the history of imperialism, into the Chinese Revolution, into the colonial history and neo-colonialism. So that really elevated his consciousness. And then he had another opportunity to be trained in Madagascar.
All right. So again, and these are just, I'm so proud of them. Look at the playlist if you haven't yet. Watch the latest, the one before this on the illicit history of neoliberalism, history and narration by Mark Blythe. But Matt, why should people go to patreon.com/TMBS and become a patron now at any level?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at recent guests, we've been pretty, on the camera there, we've been pretty strong. We had Zizek recently. We've had the Reed family men, Adolph Reed, and some big names coming up in the future that people might be interested in. And not only recently, but we had Brianna Joy Gray before she was Bernie's spokesperson. So we have the conversations here, folks. And also, there's a lot more of it because we keep hitting up against the limit for Libsyn and how much audio we can upload. So I need to convert it into smaller files, and we already convert to smaller files. So that's how much we've raised the output. We're hitting, I mean, like 3-to-1 premium to public audio at this point. And like you said, we're releasing that all eventually. But if you're a patron, you get that right away, and you get notified when it comes out.
And you help shape this really important. I mean, the role we play in the ecosystem, I'm really confident about, and I know it's really important. If you're watching this now, also smash the like button, and if you want, you can throw us a super chat. That's all great too. But go to patreon.com/TMBS. You can also, I guess my book is going for more prints, so hold tight a little bit. But go order yourself a copy of Against the Web at Red Emma's Worker Cooperative Bookstore in Baltimore. All right, guys, we're going to take a brief break, and we'll be right back with Maximilian Alvarez. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Michael Brooks here. Joining us now, Maximilian Alvarez. He is the host of the Working People podcast. He's also a writer based in Baltimore. Maximilian, how you doing? Thanks for being here.
I'm good, brother. Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure. So you do a very important podcast because you're really doing, I mean, I would say almost like stud Sturkle kind of journalism, which we need to revive and honor as much as possible. But you're getting on the ground, you're looking at different trends in the labor movement and also just people's day in and day out work conditions in our time. A lot of the energy right now is obviously around Corona. What are the big takeaways so far? I mean, we'll get to maybe some of the pushback and some of the potential in terms of some of the kind of work actions and reviving of trade unionism in a second. But, in broad strokes, what are you getting from talking to essential frontline workers that are out of work? What are the kind of main themes and trends?
So I think there may be two that I would point out. One is perhaps a bit more hopeful, and the other is, probably a bit more sinister. Sorry, my cat's on the desk.
That's fine, man.
And we've talked about this before, that I put a lot of work into putting together these two big special episodes of the podcast, which is primarily Working People as a podcast where I kind of do these in-depth interviews with workers about their lives, and not just the work that they do, but where they come from, how they became who they are, what their jobs are like, and we kind of really try to get deep down into the raw human tissue of working people's lives. But obviously I thought it was important to do some sort of special episode on what's happening during the COVID crisis. And so we put out a call. I talked to a bunch of workers and organizers, solicited submissions, and I ended up kind of compiling and editing and publishing around 6 hours of testimonies from workers around the country, even outside of the US, and organizers around the country who are living, working, and fighting through this. And, I think one thing that really comes through is something that I think we can all relate to, is that people are feeling very alone, very isolated. And that, it speaks to something that, any good labor organizer will tell you, right? I mean, like, that sense of belonging and connectedness is something that has been systematically destroyed, in our kind of working lives, in sectors across the country, right? We've become so atomized and so disconnected and so alienated from each other, on those kinds of human levels, that I think we are all feeling, we're feeling that lack most strongly right now. And so I think that speaks to the need that we all have to kind of work to address, to kind of rehumanize ourselves in each other's eyes, reestablish that sort of connection, or establish it for the first time, and really make ourselves and our fellow workers feel like we belong, and we belong together, and that we have each other's back. And I think more and more people are starting to do that. And that's where I get perhaps to the second part about what I see in broad strokes from listening to all the testimonies and talking to so many workers, is that, this is by no means a new or fresh take, but, the pandemic has forced us to confront the sickness that was already there, and that was always there, right? The sickness of our political economy, the sickness of our marketized healthcare system, the sickness of our entire work culture. So many workers that I talk to, are living and breathing the hypocrisy of being called essential by the very same people who treat their lives as expendable. People who are risking their lives, going outside, and they're risking their lives, their health, and their family's health to go outside, to pay rent, which they shouldn't have to pay, to make ends meet, because they don't have the resources to stay indoors like those of us who are privileged enough to do so. They are experiencing and highlighting, more than ever, right, just how unfree they always were, and at the same time that people are complaining about being locked indoors and that their freedoms are being stripped away, the workers who are still keeping our world running are really highlighting the disparity that was always there in, who gets to enjoy that freedom and whose back that freedom is predicated upon. And this is something that I know you talk about beautifully in your new book.
So actually, I want to tease that out a little bit. I mean, this whole kind of distinction of the politics of quote unquote recognition versus actually getting things for people. It seems like it's so viciously illustrated. You know, I remember a couple of weeks ago, President Obama putting out like this is the time where we recognize the bike messengers. And you're like, you know, how about a lot more than quote unquote recognition for people who, you know, again, I mean, literally, I mean, people are cashiers, the greengrocers are dying because of serving these functions and delivery people and so on. What is the conversation there about, even frankly, like, look, I'm not opposed to people clapping at 7 o'clock. I'm not, you know, I'll admit I've got my own, I get sort of embarrassed at public displays like that generally. So maybe I've got my own whatever, but there is something, you know, I really do wonder. I'm always like, while you're clapping, like, what kind of tip are you leaving on that delivery? And much more importantly for that, did you vote for Bernie? You know, or, you know, what are you doing? Or, you know, are you giving Cuomo a high approval rating? Like, what is that sort of conversation inside, you know, that you've encountered of people relating to like, but no money?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it does vary depending on who you talk to.
Right.
You know, because in the COVID episodes that we put together, a couple different workers addressed this, but I guess it all kind of boils down to the same thing, which is, you know, obviously, you know, it's appreciated, right? It's nice to be recognized and for people to at least nominally kind of recognize the value of your work. But I think the longer things go on and the less kind of material support that follows that sort of symbolic recognition, the more that working people start to ask, who is this recognition for? Like, who exactly are you trying to make feel better about this? Like, I think I always, you know, there was a time in my young adolescent life when the book Fight Club was a good book to me. But I think a lot about that one character who got his name after he died. And it feels a lot like that, right? It feels a lot like this kind of eerie, sacrificial naming of essential workers that comes with the price tag of being fed to the virus, being fed to, you know, the very dangerous situation that we are in right now. You know, I think I had a tweet a little while back where I said, you know, if the U.S. starts calling you a hero, run, right? Because there are only like two interpretations of that. Either one, they are commending you for doing the murderous bidding of empire, or they are preparing to sacrifice you at its feet. And, you know, neither of those, you know, like really works out well for working people. But, you know, I think to go back to what I was saying before about what this, how this virus has kind of highlighted just the kind of broad and systemic injustices that we were still living with before this virus hit, but that hopefully will become unlivable after this. You know, I think one thing that has really baffled me and that has baffled a lot of workers is that they could be called essential, but still, you know, be treated like crap, still receive crap wages, still not have kind of any sort of, you know, like broad political support as embodied in the two candidates of our current presidential election. And there is this kind of weird logical slippage in the reactionary, you know, mindset. You don't even have to be a full-blown reactionary to think it, but it's something that infects us because of the culture that we live in, where you could say with a straight face that that people who work unskilled jobs are still essential workers, right? You could still, in the same breath, dehumanize them and devalue their labor and thus justify their, you know, inhumane treatment and their inability to make a, you know, happy, joyful, dignified lives for themselves and their families, but still claim that the jobs that they do are essential. And what you're essentially saying is that the importance of your job, to the point that our society would crumble without it, has nothing to do with the value of your labor and you as a worker. And, I think that, going to the question of like the worker mobilizations that are happening right now, the budding kind of efforts that are happening across the country with workers being more militant, I think that's really, really inspiring, and it's really essential. We have going back to April, GE workers, protested, demanding to make ventilators. Auto workers around Detroit, shut their plant down momentarily when their coworkers tested positive. There was the National Healthcare Day of Action in April 15th by nurses. Whole Foods sick out. 10,000 Instacart workers went on strike. Pittsburgh sanitation workers went on, staged a walkout. There were the May Day walkouts organized by great groups like Amazonians United, Target Workers Unite, the Gig Workers Rising, Whole Worker, and others. And I mean, sanitation workers in New Orleans are on strike right now for hazard pay. And the staffing agency that they work for, which I wrote it down, is called Metro Service Group. So Google them. They're bringing in inmates to scab right now, and instead of just paying the hazard pay that they need. And so that type of collective worker action is vital, and we need to show support for it however we can. But to tie this all together, what I was saying before about kind of the ways that we're being forced to question just the kind of inherent work culture that we have in this country, and the kind of hierarchical arrangement that we just abide when we're not going through a global pandemic, that is coming into question in a way that I think the labor movement in this country is needed. It is needed that to gain broader support, from people across sectors, across classes. I think about this bonus episode for the podcast that I just released with Cooper Caraway, who's a brilliant and amazing native labor organizer and president of the AFL-CIO in Sioux Falls, North Dakota. But we talked about the labor movement, and he had this amazing quote where he said, the labor movement didn't start with, when the first union was formed, right? The labor movement has existed on this planet ever since the first time that one person needed to serve another in order to survive. And in that moment, the labor movement was born. In that moment, that sort of fire in our bellies that speaks to that sort of injustice, that sort of unfreedom that we can't abide. I think that fire is growing in a lot more people, and I hope that we carry that fire forward and help it grow.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so specifically, is that going towards, and I keep trying to make this distinction because I think some people honestly are, I think when they point to things like, hey, look at how popular Bernie's agenda is or something. Yeah, there's truth to that and there's some opportunity, but we also need to be real that like we're facing really major losses. And there is, as I was saying, like in the opening commentary, just a serious consolidation around monopoly capital right now. And at the same time, the fact that after a decades-long, there's a decades-long propaganda war against organized labor that went along with, judicial, legislative, lobbying, and the way globalization was designed to undermine labor. And it does seem like in the last couple of years, at the very least, we're still very behind in terms of the legal infrastructure for people, but there's a gap that's being closed in terms of the propaganda war. And more people in workplaces are thinking to themselves, you know what, the best way to protect myself at Whole Foods is not for John Mackey to do a vision quest where he decides I should get a face mask because, some guru told him, but maybe I have a labor union. Right.
Well, I mean, this is kind of I guess is going all the way back to what Marx talked about, right? Is like the capitalist class can't help themselves, right? They will always work towards the kind of consolidation of wealth and power at the top, and just turning the rest of us into this vast, disaffected, exploited class. And it's like culture allows us to kind of buy into that ideology, that belief that we could still make it, that we can still get, you know, like a stable, comfortable life and retire with dignity, you know, when times are relatively okay, when there's still some hope for upward mobility. But you know, the powers that be, both in the kind of, you know, in Washington, D.C. down the road, but also Wall Street, again, they can't help themselves, you know, and I think that since the recession, especially, you know, and the quote unquote recovery afterwards, right, Democrats, Republicans, and Wall Street have shown just how uninterested they are, or how confident they are, I guess I would say, that regardless of how much they screw the rest of us over, regardless of how much they hoard wealth and power and resources, you know, amongst themselves in broad daylight, you know, like they're not even trying to hide it anymore. Their confidence is that we will be so disorganized and disaffected, and we will be at each other's throats, and we will have so many legal and institutional barriers in our way that we won't be able to do anything about it. And I think that, you know, you're absolutely right to kind of point out that, you know, as exciting as the kind of labor mobilizations in the past years and going on right now are, we have a long way to go. You know, the labor movement is nothing compared to what it was, and it's nothing compared to what it needs to be. And I think that we are starting to get more people kind of involved in that process, get more people interested in labor struggle. And that's an essential part. Now we need to forge those sorts of bonds between people who are now just joining the fight, now becoming interested in the fight, and plug them in with people who have been doing this fight for years and decades, and who have so much knowledge that we need to learn, and who can show us how to build community with our fellow workers and actually win. Because we're going to need that, because then the next step is that once we start getting more organized, you know, across sectors and on a more mass scale, we're going to run up against the roadblocks that, you know, have been put in place over decades, right? You know, the Janus decision in the Supreme Court was just one, you know, thing among many that alludes to the fact that, like, institutionally, the powers that be have been trying to dismantle any sort of recourse that working people have to get justice in this country. And like I said, we're playing very far behind, and we're going to need a lot of sweat and blood and solidarity to kind of overcome those sorts of obstacles. But, you know, like you said, I think it is really, really hopeful that that propaganda, kind of that anti-labor propaganda effort, is starting to, or if it hasn't already, lost a lot of its momentum. And there are other, you know, counter propaganda efforts that are doing the vital work that we need to do, you know, in our respective circles, especially us who are involved in, you know, media, you know, to help educate people, to help lift up the voices and struggles and stories of our fellow workers, to platform organizers and labor journalists who can teach us what we need to know. You know, I think, you know, more than anything, like, you know, people ask me all the time, like, what do workers think? And I say, you know, the whole premise of Working People is that I can't speak for workers, right? You know, more than anything, I speak for the cause of speaking to our fellow workers, right? You know, I think we need to make that more of a concerted effort on all of our parts, and not just an anecdotal exercise. And the exciting thing is there are a lot of people there who are already doing that, and who, you know, we can learn from and plug into. And I really want to give them a shout out, because, you know, you mentioned Studs Terkel, who I referenced in the very first episode of Working People that I ever did with my dad. You know, I gave him a shout out because I see myself, you know, partaking in that beautiful tradition that Studs was a part of. But I share in that tradition, and I have learned, you know, in that tradition from amazing labor writers and journalists and activists like Sarah Jaffe and Michelle Chen with the Belabored podcast at Dissent, Michael Sainato at The Guardian, Juliana Feliciano Reyes at the Philly Inquirer, Edward Ongwezo Jr., Laura Gurley at Vice, Mindy Iser, Sarah Lazar, Hamilton Nolan at Indies Times, Kim Kelly, Chris Brooks, Kenzo Shibata, the newsletters Strike Wave, Labor Notes, Payday Report, Working Class Heroes, The Red Nation, Rust Belt Abolition Radio. Like, there's so many great shows that people
it's the end
take
of a
advantage
record.
of it. Take advantage of it. Get involved in it. Right?
Yeah.
There's so much there, and I think we have a real opportunity here to create the kind of grassroots, bottom-up media ecosystem that we always deserved. We can make the working people that we are trying to reach part of the media that we are producing, and we can use that media to build the sort of politics that we need. Sorry, that was a long rant, but I wanted to give a shout out.
I like that. That was the end of a 90s record. But Maximilian Alvarez, I really appreciate your time, man. It's the Working People's Podcast. Check it out. Max, thanks, man. Stay safe.
Thanks, brother. You too.
Be well. All right, guys, let's take a really brief break. We'll come right back, and shortly we're going to get to the great Adolf Reed Jr. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now, honor, pleasure, privilege as always, Adolph Reed Jr. Adolph, thanks so much for doing this. How you doing?
Oh, hey, man, I'm okay. It's my pleasure. It's always fun. And I'm going to start out with giving a shout out to Atlantic City and Bob McDevitt and my brothers and sisters in Unite Here Local 54, which the T-shirt's from a bar, obviously, from an Irish bar. I mean, down there, it's a great bar. Anybody down underneath you should go. But they're struggling now, and there's a big political change on the verge of happening, possibly, down there. So we're watching that too. But anyway, it's always great to be on and to talk to you, Michael. And I talked to Teray this morning, and he said to say hi.
Oh, awesome! That was great to have.
Yeah, and he had a lot of fun too. So it was good.
So David was joking. David didn't know that Teray was your son.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we were joking about is that sometimes you'll reference your son when you talk because he's a fellow peer and academic now. Maybe not peer, but a fellow academic. And and so what we were saying was like, if Adolph didn't have like a fully grown son who was also a successful academic, this is some type of, it would have been like a Dookie Howser situation. You have like this genius kid.
Yeah, well, I noticed. I can't remember now whether it was when he was on your show. I think it was actually. Like he made a reference to how he got interested in history, and he mentioned that on long car trips we would talk about history. And I noticed that somebody wrote in the comments and like then they get back and play catch, and I thought, yeah, that's exactly what we did.
That's great. That's excellent. So
yeah, I mean, I wound up like he wound up getting me embarked on a 10-year career as a baseball coach.
Really?
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, what happened was when he moved up to the 9 and 10-year-old league, it was an almost all rookie team. And the manager, who was a good guy, was a holdover, and he didn't have any assistant coaches because all the coaches left with their kids. And he asked at the parents' meeting, and nobody said anything. So, I'm a good Catholic boy. I said, "Well, if you can't find anybody else," and it was like that through high school.
That's awesome. I actually remember in Little League I was the best player on a terrible team, and the coach was this nice guy who, like all the other coaches in this Little League had a completely, they were insane. It's like, look, we're 11 years old, we're 12 years old. You're not going to be able to relive your high school fantasies of sports glory through us. Right. And this guy wasn't like that at all. So he picked off a couple of people who were decent, and then everybody else could, barely throw the ball. And he got all of that, and then all the other teams, were sponsored by like the local plumber or whatever. Right. And we were, and I can't believe I'm admitting this, and thank God there's no photographic evidence or pre-digital photographic evidence. We were the DARE team, so we were the anti-drug. It's so embarrassing.
Oh, that's great.
Dare to resist drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, well, it's stuck, I can see.
Oh yeah, totally. It's a very clean lifestyle. But this is apropos because I wanted to talk to you about your own political trajectory and how you developed this anti-essentialist framework. So, I mean, take that any way you want to go, man. Like what is the connection between how you develop this anti-essentialist framework and your own political process as an academic, but also somebody who's been, an actual organizer for decades too?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I was inclined to call myself a Marxist before I knew what it was, right? So what that meant was that I was inclined to look for material explanations for stuff, and I could see exploitation, right? I mean, I wasn't, the genius child. It was like a family phenomenon, right? I just inherited the family business. I came through Black Power, right? Like I was a product of the Black Power moment, but I always had like a class perspective with me. And there were ways that, the race line could like seem to make sense if you didn't ask any questions, right? Like everything could work at the level of internal consistency, right? Like if you assume all the assumptions, or if you take all the assumptions at face value and don't try to fit them to the outside world, then it could all seem to work. I can't remember if you did, but I grew up Catholic, so I was prepared for that kind of ontology. But the problem was that I was prepared for that kind of ontology, right? So I could see the holes in it, right? And then, I spent a year as an organizer when I was in college with the SWP's youth organization, the Young Socialist Alliance. So I read more Marx then, I'd read more before and read more after. And it just seemed like these big, what's the word I'm looking for? Taxonomical abstractions just didn't make sense, right? And one of the reasons I had problems with geometry when I was in high school was I had trouble accepting the shit you have to posit, right? Because I wanted explanations. So I wanted explanations for that stuff too. And then as the movement was developing around me, and I wasn't the only one going this direction. I had friends and comrades in North Carolina who were kind of moving in the same way. And when I went to graduate school, I ran into more of them because my program, drew people like us. And we just started trying to think the abstractions down to the ground, down to actual material social relations. Like,
could you give an example of that?
Yeah. What's an example? A good one is the Black community, right? So who speaks for the Black community? Who makes a determination as to who speaks authentically for the interests and concerns of this abstraction called the Black community? And frankly, it helped. Not just being in the PhD program, but being in Atlanta at the moment of racial transition in the local politics. You could see it happening, right? You could see the class character of the transition. You could see how the populist or communitarian symbols that had been associated with the radicals were so easily taken up by the bourgeois politicians because it was all superficial stuff, right? So, I spent, probably close to a decade once I stumbled onto the Frankfurt School, right? I spent probably close to a decade trying to figure out how a distinction that Habermas made at one point, I think this was probably in a legitimation crisis, a distinction between cultural practices and formations that are organic and those that are structurally produced and deployed. And I spent close to a decade trying to make sense of that distinction, trying to make it concrete, and couldn't. And my default is that when there's some shit that I don't understand, then I will think for a long time, I think sometimes too long, that there's something wrong with me, like I've got a brain dysfunction or something where I just can't grok the subtlety of this distinction and get really pissed off. And I was one of them. And after about a decade, I realized, the more, I studied anthropology like in college, but I read a lot more afterward. And the more that I started thinking like a Marxist anthropologist I thought, well, of course I can't make sense of this distinction because it's bullshit, right? Because every, cultural node is strategically produced and deployed in some way, right? And then that got me thinking back through. It was kind of a liberating moment, actually, because it got me thinking back through shit like, not just nature culture, but Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, And I realized that all that stuff is bullshit, right? And there's no traditional society versus modern society. It's all like self-congratulatory bullshit. And that social orders are constantly made, and they're constantly made through conflict and contradictions or whatever, right? At the same time, I tell you what, like I got interested, I can tell you exactly when I got interested academically in the race theory stuff. When was it? Probably around the turn of the century, when Ward Connerly, who was like, asshole from Southwest Louisiana, who went to California and became an even bigger asshole, was pushing what he called the California Civil Rights Initiative, which was a ballot initiative that would have prohibited the state of California from keeping records by race, except for 2 instances. And it's when I found out what the 2 instances were that the process began that culminated in my taking this up as a research area. The 2 instances were law enforcement and public health. And I thought, okay, so if you accept that race is a biological fiction, right, then the last thing you want to do is make an exception for public health. It should be just the opposite.
Right.
And everybody can see the mischief that the law enforcement stuff would permit. So I thought, okay, like I'm going to write an op-ed piece because, it's like in the 2000s already, and I'd been doing that kind of stuff for a while for one of the major papers in California. But because I'm kind of political person that I am, I thought that before I wrote anything or got too far in it, I would check with the opposition forces and see how they were dealing with these problems. And I was stunned.
The people opposition to Connolly.
Yeah, right.
Okay. And I just want to tell people, just in case they didn't know, Ward Connolly was coming very much from the right. And he was a kind of, quintessential kind of 90s Black Republican.
Right.
And we need to pull our pants up and this type of crap.
No, that's right. That's exactly right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep.
But what stunned me was that the opposition seemed to be accepting, the terms here and claiming, in my understanding, erroneously, that that if this thing passed, we would no longer be able to track the diseases that we as people of color get. So I was flabbergasted, right? Because I thought, okay, well, I can't write anything now because it's whatever I write would be appropriated by the other side. So that just started me, to work on it, and it's been an area of interest ever since. Now I can't recall a moment in my life that I believed that race was a real thing. You know what I mean? It's and this is partly because of the anthropological background, I guess, right? Because you understand pretty quickly that Homo sapiens as a species, right, does not come divided into subpopulations that are larger than the immediate breeding group, right?
Right.
But also, just having lived, right? This, and especially, to be honest, from being down here. I remember after my 9th grade year, we went on a trip to Notre Dame and to Loyola in Chicago, and there were sort of Catholic, summer school things. And I think the one at Loyola is Jesuit, so it's like the confraternity of Christian doctrine, Catholic social justice thing. Mm-hmm. And we were in a little meeting, right? A racial justice, right? Discussion, and this white girl from St. Louis, who was, blonde but really heavily freckled, said that she didn't have anything against intermarriage herself. She was just concerned because of the kids. And I said, well, so what about the kids? And I said, and she said, well, because the kids will be born speckled. And I said, where did you hear that from? And I pointed to what one of the seniors at my high school and said to her, which is true. I said, look, I mean, she's black, right, or colored or Negro or whatever we were then, and she looks whiter than you do, right?
Right.
And that's even before the freckles, right? I mean, so, and I mean, one of the things now about spending time here, it's really like in the Caribbean or like any place in Latin America. Like you can't. 15 minutes, you figure out the folly, right? At the folk level. But I mean, beyond that, I mean, I'd say really, it was even before. Now that I think about this, it was even before that epiphany with the Connolly thing that I'd been engaged against, philosophical essentialism in talking about race and gender in the American Academy. I think we can probably trace that back, sometime in the 80s or probably even earlier, I guess.
So just to kind of summarize it, as best I'm understanding. So one, you have a Marxist orientation. You go through Black Power with all of its obvious appeals, particularly at that time.
Yeah, and to a 19 and 20-year-old too.
What'd you say?
And to a 19 and 20-year-old too.
Right, absolutely. And then you have this, you see the internal contradictions. Then you see the ways, if I'm understanding you, in which like the aesthetics of radicalism can easily migrate to conservative Democratic Party politics in Atlanta in the 70s. So that, a historical example we've talked about is like maybe Baird Rustin seems really boring in the 60s. And then you realize actually him and A. Philip Randolph are, in addition to fighting American apartheid and Jim Crow, they're talking about labor demands and social provisions that it can't just be delivered by some kind of, HR, some sort of corporate backed patronage machine. Right. But, that same machine, while keeping forward the same core economic policies, can, wear different clothes and signify different things. And look, maybe, I'm not, maybe there's some value to that. Maybe there isn't, but that is not structural and economic. So then you go through there, and then if I'm understanding you correctly, and this is where I think your work is so illustrative, because right now we are just bombarded by essentialist narratives of any sort. Yeah. Of every sort, but you kind of point out in your work that like some of the response to a class-based and also racist tract like the bell curve, that some of that response doesn't go into interrogating the very work of trying to creating those subcategories of humans to build descriptive hierarchies to justify a particularly predatory form of capitalism, which is how I read that book. That it instead of trying to skip that and interrogate the map, it just builds a counter map. Right. Yeah. Answer that.
That's right. Right. That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. No, absolutely. Right. Absolutely. And the fundamental problem with that stuff is it's ontological, but even before being ontological, it's idealist. Right. Can
you explain that to people? I think that's really important.
Yeah. Idealism is a philosophical orientation that presumes that ideas are real things. And have a real force and can do things in the world, and that they have essences ultimately, and the essences can be realized in the world. So, for instance, I mean, one of the things that always kind of tickles me about late Victorian and Edwardian race science, right, is that the race theorists spent a lot of time constructing ideal taxonomies, right? Like what the quintessential type of the Teuton was, or like the lower Galatian or whatever the fuck, right? Right, because at this time there were like as many as 36 different races inside Europe, depending on who's counting. And they were so fixated on trying to get these exact taxonomies, right, to identify like the pure Nordic type or the pure Gallic type or whatever, which was always only an intellectual abstraction from taxonomic characteristics that they fucking made up, right? So, so I mean, there's always like, well, who says like a Nordic has a high vaulted forehead or whatever, right? And what the fuck does that even mean? And then what they did was they went out to measure actually existing populations according to their approximation to or distance from the ideal type of that geographic area, right? When all of it was just pure, made up, okey doke bullshit, right? But they were absolutely convinced it was scientific. And the cool thing about it, for me anyway, from a teaching point of view, is that the harder they tried to specify it scientifically, the more they exposed that they couldn't, right? Because you just can't. All these classificatory systems are totally arbitrary, right? And there's always like the who says. So anyway, I mean, so I think now fast forward, I guess, to like the 1980s, and the emergence of what was called identity politics. What you see is that essentialism takes the form, well, it takes a couple of different forms. The first variant is the naive one, right? It's like you posit a population category and you impute a way of thinking, values, right, or whatever to it. Okay, so blacks are X, all right? So that implies that there's something essential about being black that lives inside the person, right? Like it's there, whether or not you want it, right? So I mean, going back to the beginning of the 20th century or like the end of the 19th century, that's where, that's the little scientific logic, underneath the figure of the tragic mulatto, right? Because what's tragic is the mulatto looks like he or she is white, but has this essence that keeps them ever from being truly white, right? All right, so that's like garden variety race essentialism, and you can do the same thing with gender, right? Or I mean, whatever else. And then, I guess by the mid 90s, probably, as the identities began to proliferate, then people started saying, well, but wait, I'm a man, but I'm also black. Or really, no, to be more honest, I'm a woman, because it's like the privileged identities. And I'm also black. So like my blackness makes me different from white women, and my womanness makes me different from black men. And I know there's a cut of the Black Studies budget and a cut of the Women's Studies budget that I should have access to, because that's where all this stuff lives, right? Right, I'm at the political economy of racial or gender representation. And so, ironically, the notion of intersectionality comes into existence, and I can't see people typing on the side now, but I'm sure that shit's going crazy. As
we have the best people, Adolph, and they're very smart, and they do a tremendous job, frankly. So
yeah, okay.
You better talk about my audience like it's Trump talking about his people.
Right. Totally. I take that back. So
they're great people, and they do a great job.
Right. Oh, totally,
Yeah,
totally.
yeah.
I didn't notice the moment where one of them discovered that Touré has a 3-door closet in his basement. But and that was side chatter for about 2 or 3 minutes.
Right.
But then the squirrel ran past and their attention changed. But anyway.
Right. Okay, they have no attention spans. Now hit intersectionality. Go for it. Build some more bridges.
Right, exactly. So the irony of the intersectionality thing is that it came into existence as a way to solve the problem that the big essentialized identities were like too big and too capacious and didn't capture enough discrete experiences. But what what intersectionality does instead is instead of dissolving the problem or resolving the problem of essentialism by dissolving the essentializing categories, it increases them, right? It's like fission, right? So it increases. So there are more. So there's a special perspective of a Black woman. There's a special perspective of a gay Black woman, right? And goes on and on and on. Ironically, a few years earlier, something similar had happened around the mixed race notion, right? Because a lot of people who were advocating mixed race, and what I got from a reliable source on this is that who attended what she described as the Million Mulatto March, like in DC, which was actually a couple hundred people, was like white mothers of mixed race kids who wanted to have some separate identity for them. And, why not? Like, if that's the game you're playing, I can't beef about it. But ironically, well, a lot of people understood the mixed race category as a way to jump out of the racial binaries. It actually just produced more discrete and sharply defined racial categories. So, all right. So, that's the intersectionality thing.
I just want to be clear too,
Yeah.
and that the critique, and it's interesting because it has nothing to do with, and this is something that at least I've been sort of banging on, and is definitely elemental to your work and to Ray's work, that this is a separate trajectory from the idea and the project of making sure basically that everybody has legal and civic equity in a political society or a democracy, that there's no discrimination in terms of housing, employment, voting, public assembly, or anything else.
Right.
That is one trajectory. But then on the other hand, that instead of looking at these descriptive hierarchies, recognizing their origins and where they're coming from, and trying to unsettle them, you end up reifying them in a more and more and more precision and replication.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, in the academy, it became like an issue in the 90s because of the premise that to be able to study the X, you got to be an X, right? And my first reaction to that is, well, like, I'm interested in the 19th century. I don't got a time machine. So how can I do that?
Right.
Because it's the same principle, right? And it's fundamentally anti-intellectual, right? And I mean, this was also the moment when people really got fat off of ragging on the Enlightenment. And I've always been kind of an Enlightenment sort of guy, right? At least some pieces of it, right? Like a lot of pieces of it, actually. The objection to clerical authority, right? No matter what the cleric is, right? But people often enough would hear that and bristle, right? But when I'd say, yeah, well, I think the Enlightenment was pretty good. I mean, I remember when I gave my job talk at the New School, one of my colleagues, he's a great guy actually, but asked me at one point in the Q&A. He first remarked and said, "Wow, like there's some ways in which you sound like a really a statist liberal." And he said, "So why is it that you are so committed to the state?" And I think he was looking for something that was Locke or Rousseau or whatever, or even Marx. But I just said to him, "Well, because I want to make sure that the people who live on the other side of the hill can't come and eat me, right?" And I think that's one reason that we need the state, right? And I think the Enlightenment was like that too, right? Like you can't. And I mean, the idea. See, I mean, I sometimes joke that post-Toastyism of whatever sort is like demonic, right? Because this idea that I have my truth and you have your truth, and as Walter Ben Michaels argues, splendidly in The Shape of the Signifier, what that means is it is a disagreement is no longer there's no more space for argument, right? There's difference. There's no space. There's no space for disagreement. And that's like the end of. And believe me, I can't believe that I was almost tempted. That's like the end of society, right? Like I was almost tempted to say the end of civil society, which is a phrase that I've never uttered in my life, without contempt. And I think I just saved myself from doing it then. But you know what I mean, right? Thank you.
So that's okay. So actually, all right. Well, actually, I'll come back to that later. So the way I would read you then, and this is actually how it could correlate with some defense of certainly like a social democratic state as it's under siege from neoliberalism from the 70s to today.
Right.
That this starts to correlate very specifically with the prospect of a mass politics. Because if you're basically saying, and this is the kind of incredible dual role that I get from reading you, that these discourses that can sound so radical, but then they end up reifying. I mean, basically, look, if the only position that we can have is our own enclosed space and absolutely micro-specific way of experiencing the world, right, the only upshot of that is just relating to the world through this thing.
Right. Yeah.
I can plan, I can tailor all of my content, I can never come across any kind of experience in that temporal realm, which is only getting reinforced by this fucking coronavirus.
Oh yeah.
That ever steps out of that. And so that, and it, that the notion that one's subjectivity can also get run and be in a feedback with other people's truths as well as objective truths and shared aspirations.
Right.
That you sort of can't do something like, let's just make it really concrete, build a campaign for single payer in South Carolina.
No.
You can't organize to achieve a broad-based objective that might benefit the overwhelming mass of human beings, because nothing can be achieved outside of that restricted space. And then if nothing can be achieved, then the societal defaults that benefit those who have power anyways will just run themselves.
Right. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, I mean, for them, right? It's not so great for us, but it works very, very well for them.
What is the difference between one thing that I've heard that's a interesting, or maybe it's not that interesting pushback, but I think it's a distinction that gets kind of collapsed, is if you go in and if you start to say that particularly racism as we experience it in modern, in the United States in 2020, that the history of it is even, with all of the differences at different historical points and making it a more nuanced conversation, but the origins of it do go back to the Victorian stuff that you were talking about before, that basically if we're going to go out and rape and pillage and steal people's shit, we're going to create scientific and religious stories that generate narratives of their subhumanity to justify stealing their shit and murdering them and enslaving them. And and you can make this point, and again, the reason that this is an important point to make is that, I mean, there's nothing exculpatory about that at all. That's quite evil, in fact, if you want to use that terminology. But it puts us in the realm of politics. It puts us in the realm of economics. And I'll hear some, folks on the kind of liberal side that want to say that this stuff is trans-historical, can't be complicated at all. They'll say like, well, okay, but what about I don't know, an ancient civilization and two people encounter each other and they don't like the cut of each other's jibs. Like, isn't there something that's just innate or essential to human nature?
Yeah.
And I just like you to tee off on the real distinction. I mean, I'll throw in, I always think of the Chinese. I mean, in the ancient Chinese empire, they had this great phrase. I read it translated once, that they called their foreign policy barbarian management, which I thought was hilarious. But there were times.
Well, there
it's
you
a
go.
Good one.
Yeah.
I hope that's true. We're going to be heading into another phase of that over the next coming decades. But they, they burned their own ships at one point.
Liberal.
What?
I just said, and goddamn, I thought the Ottomans weren't fucking liberal, but
right. But talk about that difference between human beings basically maybe being wary of each other because of kind of like eyeball differences that might, relate to like a state of childhood that you go, ooh, like there's somebody else, what's going on there, versus the scientific capitalist project of classifying other humans that, I don't see how you could separate that from what started to happen in the, 17th century, 18th century.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, the first thing I would say to that liberal is stop watching fucking Alley-oop cartoons, right? Because that's not the way that things were back in the day either, right? So often, and it's like an issue that trips up a lot of people. Often people I wouldn't have expected to be tripped up. So it's kind of like a category error, right? And like this is where it's kind of helpful that we are a species that thinks and expresses ourselves through taxonomies, right? Because you can say, ethnocentrism it could be like a human universal, maybe. I'm not prepared to grant that, necessarily, but except for this conversation, or except at a level of abstraction at which it's true but trivial, right? Because how do you know what the ethnos is or the ethnoi is in contradistinction to the other? Well, you don't really until you express it. So that's when you call it ethnocentrism, right? But it doesn't have to be that, right? But like if one is the sort who likes to play around with transhistorical categories, right? You could say that, in all societies, so far as we know, there are we and they boundaries, and there's some difficulty in traversing them. Now, human societies have operated in a whole lot of different ways over time and space. And it turns out that most of the time, those what we would think of as like tribal like boundaries are very permeable. But again, like if you want to have the Brits, 19th century fantasy of what happened on the Pleistocene, right? You can play around with that. But even if that is a universal or a natural tendency, right? That doesn't really give you the tools to explain how the tendency is expressed in particular forms in different places and different historical periods, right? How could, there be Franco-German tensions in like 1830 before there was either France or fucking Germany, right?
Right.
And the whole notion of primordial hatreds is one that emerges from this fantasy, right, of primordial ethnocentrism. I mean, really, ultimately, I think that a lot of that stuff, and there's actually like a cool work on origins stories, right, among anthropologists, but among archaeological anthropologists in particular. But I mean, the idea that that there's a trans-historical disposition to dislike people who aren't like you. Well, in first place, what not being like you means has evolved and changed radically over time, right? I mean, there's a lot of good work that shows that people didn't start to recognize countenances, right? Or at least not in Europe, which is where, in a way, all of us are from, right? But people, all right, so that's going to get some shit clicking. But
Definitely.
But
I would just like to say we're all from Africa in contrast.
Well, ultimately,
yeah,
right.
Ultimately, yeah.
And see, that's the reason that I don't understand how this Ancestry.com bullshit works, right?
Right.
Right, like, you know what the real punchline is going to be. East Africa, motherfucker, that's where you're from, right? But anyway.
We should retitle the show. The punchline is East Africa, motherfucker.
I think that'd be great.
That'd be a great title for the show, yeah.
Right, but I mean, there's a lot of work showing that people didn't even start to recognize one another by countenance in Europe until into the Enlightenment, right? And that's part of like the whole complex of cultural sea changes that were happening. So, I mean, how did you know that you didn't like an Alsatian, right? Like before there was even Alsace, right?
Right.
So I mean, there's that, right? And I think interestingly, the work that the alley-oop account does, right, is always presentist work, right? Like it's always intended not really to explain the historical past, but to justify right-wing tendencies in the historical present.
And would you include, I mean, I'll be provocative, but I mean, I want, we don't have to go too much into it, but I mean, I would be curious to hear some of your thoughts on the 1619 thing, in light of that, if you want to touch on it briefly. But we don't need to go too much into it, but I think it's, it tracks with some of what you're saying.
Well, no, I think it definitely does. And I mean, it's kind of hard for me because the first sentence in the first essay is a lie, right? In 1619, 20 African slaves, the first 20 African slaves showed up in North America. The fact is they weren't slaves. So it's time to drop the curtain, pack up the props, and go home, right?
What were they?
They were sold as indentured servants, and they served a time of indenture, and they melted into the population of, well, when they were serving it, they melted into the population of indentured servants, and then they were free, right? I mean, there's like a 50-year period, and for listeners who would be interested in this, there are two great sources. The original one is Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, and the newer one is my colleague Kathleen Brown's first book, Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, and Anxious Patriarchs, and that's a study. They're both studies of the emergence of race and class, and in Brown's case, also gender, as technologies of hierarchy in colonial Virginia over the 17th century. And there's like there's a good 50 to 60 year period between the time that the first Africans showed up and the time that you come out the other end of it with slavery and a racialized understanding of slavery. Like you can watch over the course of that half or 2/3 of a century, how gradually, and it's at the local court level, right? It's not big statutes of the House of Burgesses, where gradually the distinctions between slaves and indentured servants become sharpened, and the distinction between enslaved and free blacks become compressed. And they both point out that show how this was in response to other shit that was going on in colonial Virginia that had to do with, oh my God, I don't believe it, political economy, right? The market for indentured servants from England was drying up, partly because after the first generation of Anglo-Virginians got settled in and began to see themselves not as hustlers who were getting rich to go back to England, but as a founding ruling class.
Right.
Shit got nastier and nastier. And they got more and more brutal. And the word got back to England. People said, fuck it, I'd rather go in the galleys rather than go over there, right? So,
right.
So that's already wrong, right? And I mean, the argument about, the sources of the Revolutionary War. Well, it's what really, I was thinking about this earlier. If you want to identify a core problem, conceptual problem with the 1619 project, it's what Touré describes as race reductionism, right? Because that's all they see, right? I mean, so anyway.
So no, and that's interesting because even like one of the basic things that I saw that was kind of responding to it was saying like, look, the engine of the revolution is coming from New England, which has more abolitionist politics than the South, obviously. Right. Now, the Constitution is an objectively pro-slavery document, and that's a product or
with slavery.
Yeah, it's a compromise. I mean, it allows it to go on, is what I mean, and that's a political trade-off with the coalition you're trying to build across geographies to fight the battle.
Right.
And that turns it again. And I guess the question I have for you that also is disturbing to me is, why is it like nothing that has just been said says the founding fathers were great?
Right.
And what a nice thing, I mean, I remember Bill O'Reilly going, slaves should thank the Americans because they got to come. I mean, all of this, right-wing, racist, American mythologizing, none of that is happening here.
No,
it's just, in some ways, it makes it even, it adds to the varieties of obscenity. There's the class dimension, the gender dimension, and then also just the way things work wherever they are, east, west, north, south, which is like, I'm in New England. I don't happen to like slavery, but I need to partner up for muskets and money with some guys in Virginia whose whole economy is dependent on this thing. We're going to cut a deal. That's politics.
Right. Yeah. Well, And on top of that, I mean, look at, Jim Oakes is somebody you should have on too, actually. Like his book, The Scorpion Sting, is really great on this issue, actually. But because there was, from the beginning, a separate tradition of anti-slavery constitutionalism, right? And what some of the anti-slavery founders, I'm not saying all, right? But what they thought was, okay, well, because of the deal, right, you've got to accept slavery where it exists, right? But they wanted to make sure that it couldn't expand. And the idea behind the scorpion's sting was that if you could freeze the institution in the lower South, right, and wean away the border states, it couldn't survive and it would shrivel and die. Well, in the first place, they were too optimistic about being able to wean away the border states. But that tradition was there. What's also interesting about this, right, is, and like this, pardon me, and I mean, this connects with, soft shell crab taco is really great.
I believe that. I'd like that now.
Oh yeah, but it connects with the shift from the defense of slavery as a necessary evil to the defense of slavery as a positive good that happens like in the 1830s. Because what people don't often think about is that the other thing that was happening during the 1820s and 1830s was mass enfranchisement, right? So, the emergence of universal white male suffrage, right, happens. So, say at the founding, right, you got a bunch of rich guys,
right,
sitting around a room, figuring out how to make decisions about all the rest of us, basically, about what to do with all the rest of us, slave, indentured, free, like whatever. And we're basically coming out of an historical context in which the distinction between slave and free was one that had a bunch of shit in the middle, right? So it wasn't quite as sharp. And in 1789 or 3 or 76 or 1800, Jefferson and what's his name, Madison and Patrick Henry, Rabbi Noah, the rest of them could say, and Pinckney and anybody else you can think of in South Carolina could say, look, man, I know that this institution is really ultimately kind of fucked up, but I got to get paid, right? I got to make my money. I need it. Well, so by the late 1830s, you got all these broke white guys out there voting. And the argument that, well, we need to support slavery because I got to keep making my money doesn't work quite as well, right?
Right.
And this is at the same time that, scientific racism is starting to take shape and whatever. But so, I mean, there's like a complex social and cultural and ideological dialectic that's playing out. And between, I tell you, it's a great book on this. Johnson and Rourke's Black Masters, which is a study of a slave-owning family in South Carolina, antebellum period, obviously. And one of the nice things about it is that they show how, after the nullification crisis, the South Carolina elite starts thinking more and more that the secession might actually be on the table at some point. The white yeoman and working class population is starting to grow in the state with people coming in from outside the country too. And what you see is them pretty self-consciously appealing to these working class white people and to the artisans on the basis of racial identity, right? And even as those motherfuckers were complaining about competition from the free blacks and the slaves in Charleston who actually could rent out some of their own labor to some extent. And you can see them, right, self-consciously producing something called an identity as white men to get ready for secession, right?
Right. So what's so troubling?
It's politics that's doing all this, right? Sorry.
No, that's great. No, because it isn't the idea that by complicating these things and talking about all the variables, you're taking away any of the moral punch is a problem for analysis. And then I guess, the question then becomes in 2020, not a project that took these things on, including obviously the racial dimension, but all of the dimensions, or maybe even just the racial dimension, but actually said, we're focusing on this facet of it. Not that this is the single explanatory variable for everything. Right. And I guess, and I think the stake of it, I mean, I guess if I read you correctly, is that the stake of it practically in 2020 then becomes, if we get back to making this stuff just metaphysics, then again, where do we go?
Right.
Where do we go politically? You know,
Right.
what's to be done with that?
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, could Stacey Abrams be the vice president? I mean, who gives a fuck ultimately? Right.
I don't think I think she's too thirsty in self-promotion.
No, look, absolutely, man.
Yeah.
No, totally. And that's one of the first things I learned in the faculty at Yale is that if you want tenure, well, in the first place, you're crazy to want it, right? Because it's not likely to happen. But if you want it, the absolute worst thing you can do is show that you want it.
Oh man, she is. I'm amazed, honestly, watching Stacey Abrams specifically, because everybody else that is in contention, you know, Harris and Whitmer, and you know, they're all doing like the standard, you know, I would be honored, but the focus is the election, yada yada yada. Right. Stacey Abrams is out there like I don't know. I've never seen anything like it actually.
No, I haven't either. And it's the vice presidency, you know what I mean? No, but I'm wondering whether she thinks that she can create such an embarrassing situation that Biden feels like he'd have to do it. And that's all I can figure. But I mean, she could, and
like elder abuse.
Yeah, right. Probably can browbeat him, man. But yeah, it's nuts. I mean, and like from what I understand, she makes good money off those soft porn novels that she writes. So why not just go right into the sunset? Because I think she's got like a TV movie deal, like for one of them.
Yeah, that sounds a lot more fun than being Joe Biden's vice president. I don't know about her. David and Matt are into her books. I know less about them.
Ah, okay. Yeah, well, I've just seen that.
Adolph Reed, I mean, we'll obviously have you back on again real soon. Just always such a pleasure.
Oh, yeah, man. Thank you. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much. Stay safe.
All right, brother. Take care, man.
All right, be well, brother. Thank you. Yep. Take care. All right, folks, we are gonna actually, I guess we could take a no, we'll sign off. Are you guys there, David and Matt? Yeah, okay, great. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna go, every time I talk to Adolph Reed, I feel like I just need to spend a week reading.
Yeah, those two books. I just want to say those two books that he mentioned, the Edmund Morgan, American Freedom, American Slavery, and Kathleen Brown's Good Wives, Nasty Wenches, and Anxious Patriarchs. Those are cited in the Literary Hangover episodes to do with Bacon's Rebellion. So check those out, folks.
Those both sound like good books. Maybe, you know what? Honestly, we've been talking about doing a collaboration, and the Orwell would be fun, but it would be very fun to pick one of those books and do a collaboration.
In terms of like the historicizing race and slavery and that whole discussion, like those are the books to do, basically.
I also really like the sort of getting specific, not that sort of like in-group, out-group, bigotry, whatever in the broadest sense. There's nothing specific about that, but the racism that gets generated out of imperialism to create taxidermies of other human beings, that is highly specific. And that is what we're running off of today. And that does inform essentialism. That does inform everything from, I mean, racist biases in technology as an example. I mean, that's how this stuff lives on.
That Kathleen Brown book talks about how the House of Burgesses in Virginia literally made a law where white women, they didn't have to pay taxes to the government because their contribution went to their men of the house. But black women's contributions, because they were field workers, went to the state. So you can imagine what kind of impact that has on all of these sorts of topics.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what we'll do, David, is you're going to do a gem.
Yeah.
And then we're going to go to the post game, patreon.com/TMBS. Hit the like button. David Griscom, what do we got?
Yeah, I needed to highlight how serious these job numbers that came out earlier this past week were. In April, around 20 million jobs were shed. And just like to put in context what's happened since this coronavirus crisis has hit this country. The level of total employment in the economy is now at the level that it was in 2000. So that's 20 years, 2 decades of economic growth and job growth that has become, completely evaporated through this crisis. And there's another really frustrating or frightening aspect to the jobs report that came out, because it showed that wages actually grew on average. Well, the reason for that was because the people at the bottom portion of the society, the low wage workers, those were the first people to get their jobs cut, right? Because so they called off so many low wage workers in this mass unemployment, mass firings that have been happening over the past month and a half. So much so that like the actual average wage increased, right? I mean, just think about like the devastation that's created, but now we're at a situation where obviously there is a crisis. People aren't going to work. People are losing income, but that doesn't mean that people are no longer consuming. That doesn't mean that people don't still have needs, right? So we're in this, this crisis, and obviously the solution for socialists or people with, honestly, like a brain or a heart is simple, right? It's like you need to give people access to income and access to the basic necessities of life. Well, in a neoliberal system that we have, that is almost impossible, right? Just because the institutions that we have created, the politicians who are in power, are so against that idea. You see it certainly with the Republicans, but even with the Democrats and how they're trying to deal with, this crisis. So, this whole, there's this massive unemployment crisis that's going on, and what are people doing about it? What is the government doing about it? It's certainly not doing enough, and it creates this really weird situation. Where there's basically two sides of TINA, two sides of there is no alternative, right? There's like the Democrat side, which is like, we're not going to basically provide the mass amount of stimulus that goes directly to people that is necessary, right? But, we're basically going to ask people to make massive sacrifices by staying at home. And then there's like the far right, death cult Republican side, my home state of Texas, for example, which is now massively opening up these states. And I wanted to just make it very clear to people that like the reopening of these states is not about the economy, obviously. But you can see how ineffective it is just like on a basic, like cold calculated numbers level of how inefficient the kind of reopening plan is in Texas. So, Texas has been one of the boldest states when it comes to reopening. And, one of the big things that they focused on was reopening restaurants, reopening entertainment, movie theaters, and things like that. But, there's so many rules that go with it, to protect people's health, obviously, in this crisis. So restaurants are operating at 25% capacity. And if you spend any time in the service economy or in a restaurant economy, you will understand that that is not a viable way to run a restaurant. Similar rules when it comes to movie theaters, all of these things. It's purely symbolic on a certain level what's going on there, right? It's not going to reinvigorate the economy. But you know what it is going to do? It's going to push off a whole section of people off of unemployment benefits. Because now them staying home is actually choosing to not go into work. Yep. And a lot of people who I know personally, last week, they got those calls that like, you either come back to work or, we're going to say that you have basically left your position and, you refuse the job. So what does that do? It's labor discipline on a mass scale because they still need to hyper exploit workers. They still need people to come in and to go to the meatpacking facilities, which, by the way, has been one of the worst hit across this country. But I know in Texas, in Amarillo, for example, there's been a massive outbreak at a Tyson plant that has been very much underreported. These are the people who are providing the food supply to people, and they are already the worst affected by the COVID crisis. There's been massive reinfections in the construction industry, across the board, right? So, this is one about labor discipline, and two, it's about it's labor discipline both in the sense of like trying to make people go back into work, right, so that they can be exploited by those industries, the very precarious ones. But it's also it's really is a powerful way to prevent us from being able to demand or imagine anything different, right? Because it's very simple what could and should be done in this country to take care of people. And by forcing everyone back into work in the way that they're doing across the country, across the South and a lot of other states in the U.S., they're going to push this crisis into such. It's going to wage, like, the devastation is going to be so focused on people who are already exposed financially, people who are already exposed health-wise. Hell, I even forgot to mention just the devastation that's going across elder homes across the country.
Oh, God.
I mean, it's like it's some horrible stuff that is going to be happening. It's already horrible what's been happening, since this has started. But I mean, it's just like it's very clear, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, that there are two sides that are in power in the system, right? There's this Republican side that will use every weapon. They are the hammer of neoliberal capital, right? They will put people in the front lines and they will expose them to the worst and most dangerous situations. But then the other alternative is this Democratic Party, which is basically the other functionary, because like if you don't provide people with their basic needs to survive, then honestly, the only option is to reopen the economy and to like expose everyone to this danger. I'm not advocating that, but like if you're not giving anyone another credible option, then that's the only thing that can be done, right? So, we're still in this crisis, and any kind of fantasy that we're, getting out of it or things are slowing down is completely wrong. There's a serious potential of another, massive wave. And it's very clear that we're not going to get any salvation from those, above us. We're not going to get any help from politicians, and the kind of on the ground organizing and understanding the power that we have in society is very important, because all of those people who are being forced back into work, basically they're being hit really hard with the fist of the state, so that they don't realize that they actually do hold the power in society. And we need to be making sure that we don't let the powerful achieve their goal.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's really key that people understand that it's paying out unemployment benefits is the major key reason that these Republican governors are pushing people back to work. Mm-hmm. And there's no doubt that on a bipartisan basis, they do not want people to learn to expect or live with anything better. Mm-hmm. And that's why, with Democrats, they'll be like a pittance, and again, even things like sure, don't pay rent or pay your loans at the moment, but nothing to do with forgiveness, debt jubilees. We could be erasing medical debt, erasing student debt, we could be erasing credit card debt. I mean, there's an enormous amount that we could be doing right now to just reset the economy and do an enormous amount of good for tens of millions of people that is a keystroke. And that's not on the table politically. And part of the reason it's not on the table politically is because they don't want your expectation sets to increase. Yeah. And that's really why, again, that was another really important way of understanding Bernie and why that was so important. I'm not trying to bring folks down, but the debate, we've talked a million times about why the debate about whether he's radical or not was a silly way of looking at it. Because the truth was that in our moment, even that agenda that might have economically been in the mainstream in the 50s, that people might have seen as a logical consequence, that you could have had a moderate, and certainly hawkish, a broad Democrat like Harry Truman, but who understood that everybody needed to have health care, as an example. And in today's world, that is considered extreme because, capital is so consolidated, workers are so undercut, and that is partially how we have to understand where we're at today. And again, another thing that you're right, David, when you said earlier, maybe there's potential because they can't do what they want to do in terms of like revving up more bubbles. There isn't an obvious way. There isn't a way I can see that is analogous to either the tech bubble in the 90s or the housing bubble before it crashed that can like sort of juice a lot of people's incomes. I'm not seeing that. What I'm seeing is that, you certainly could juice people's incomes, but you'd actually have to do redistributive policies and you'd have to get rid of people's debt, as an example. And they don't want to do that. And I think that creates a situation where there is a certain structural tendency towards the hammer side, because the more soft side can't really do very much. right now, and that's a reason that we're in a very dangerous moment among many others.
And I think what's really frightening too, just to put a cherry on it, is that the hammer side, I think, won't work. Not only it won't work in that it won't be able to even maintain the kind of living standards of the ruling class elite, right? The destruction of small businesses across the country that's happening right now is going to have a massive effect for everybody. So it's just they are actually, this is the last stand kind of moment here, where they actually will prevent any kind of alternative from springing out of this, just to maintain the even smaller. I guess what I'm saying is the group that's benefiting from this action is getting smaller and smaller and smaller,
right,
with each crisis.
Oh, that is 100% true, and that's yeah. There's no doubt about that. And I am aware that I said taxidermy by mistake earlier. So good catch, everybody. All right, folks, we're going to go to the post game. We'll be back here in about 10 minutes. Become a patron, patreon.com/TMBS. Thursday live stream with Vijay Prashad. And that's also going to be the Sunday show, a deep dive into how China is responding to the crisis, how Kerala is responding, and kind of a sort of Marxist view from the developing world in terms of what's happening now. Thanks to everybody who makes this show possible. We appreciate all of you, and we'll see you soon.